Most people think self-control is something you're either born with or you're not. They look at disciplined individuals and assume there's some hidden trait, some rare mental toughness they just didn't inherit. But that belief is not only wrong, it's one of the biggest reasons people stay stuck. Because when you believe self-control is talent, you stop training it. We live in a world that rewards noise, constant updates, constant reactions, constant explanations, every thought shared, every impulse expressed, every emotion broadcasted in real time. And slowly, without realizing it, this conditions the brain to confuse expression with progress and attention with achievement. Silence in this environment feels uncomfortable, almost threatening, not because it's weak, but because it removes the dopamine you've been trained to rely on. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear: staying silent is not about hiding. It's about restraint. It's about learning to sit with urges instead of obeying them. The urge to speak, the urge to explain, the urge to prove yourself before the work is done. When you resist those impulses, you are doing something rare in modern life. You are actively training self-control. The brain doesn't strengthen discipline through motivation. It strengthens it through inhibition, through pauses, through moments where you could react but don't, where you could seek validation but choose effort instead. Every time you hold back, you are reinforcing neural circuits that govern focus, patience, and delayed gratification. That is how self-control is actually built. And this matters more than ever in 2026 because the environment you're stepping into is louder, faster, and more distracting than any generation before you. The people who win will not be the most visible, the most vocal, or the most reactive. They will be the ones who can direct their attention, regulate their impulses, and tolerate silence without needing relief. Focusing on yourself doesn't mean ignoring the world. It means reclaiming control from it. Staying silent doesn't mean disappearing. It means refusing to leak energy before it compounds. When you stop performing and start regulating, something shifts. Your actions become intentional. Your discipline becomes automatic. And the version of you that emerges isn't louder. It's stronger, calmer, and far more difficult to derail. Silence is often misunderstood as a social tactic, a way to appear mysterious or dominant, but that interpretation misses what is actually happening at the psychological level. When someone chooses silence, especially in moments where speaking would be easy, tempting, or socially rewarded, they are exercising one of the most fundamental components of self-control: impulse inhibition. The urge to speak is not neutral. It is driven by dopamine seeking mechanisms in the brain that evolved to push us towards social validation, reassurance, and immediate feedback. Every time you explain yourself, react emotionally, or announce your plans, the brain receives a small reward for releasing tension and gaining attention. Silence removes that reward, and that removal is precisely what makes it powerful as a training mechanism. In modern environments saturated with constant communication, choosing not to speak becomes a form of resistance against automatic behavior. It forces the brain to tolerate discomfort instead of escaping it, and that tolerance is the foundation of self-control. The brain learns through patterns, not intentions. When you repeatedly act on impulse, the neural circuits responsible for inhibition weaken, while the circuits responsible for reaction strengthen. Over time, this creates a personality that feels impulsive, reactive, and easily distracted, even though nothing about it is fixed. Silence interrupts this loop. When you pause instead of reacting, the prefrontal regions of the brain involved in regulation and long-term planning are activated. This is not a metaphorical process, it is a measurable shift in neural activity. The act of withholding speech requires cognitive effort, attention, and restraint, all of which strengthen the same systems used for resisting distractions, delaying gratification, and maintaining focus on long-term goals. Silence, in this sense, is not passive. It is an active neurological workout that trains the brain to prioritize control over release. Social environments amplify this effect. Humans are intensely social animals, and much of our impulsive behavior is tied to how we are perceived by others. The desire to explain, defend, or signal status is deeply embedded in our psychology. When you remain silent in situations where you feel the pull to justify yourself or seek approval, you are directly confronting one of the strongest evolutionary drives: the need for social acceptance. This confrontation creates internal tension, and the brain initially interprets that tension as threat or discomfort. But with repetition, the brain adapts. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable and eventually neutral. This adaptation is the same process through which any form of self-control is built. Silence becomes a training ground where the brain learns that it does not need immediate social rewards to function effectively. There is also a temporal component to silence that is crucial for self-control. Speaking often collapses time. It provides immediate relief from uncertainty, anxiety, or anticipation. Silence stretches time. It forces the brain to remain in a state of waiting, holding information, emotion, or intention without resolution. This stretching of time is what strengthens delayed gratification. The ability to wait, to let outcomes unfold without interference, is central to disciplined behavior. People who struggle with self control often struggle not because they lack motivation, but because they cannot tolerate the gap between effort and reward. Silence trains that tolerance. It teaches the brain that nothing catastrophic happens when gratification is postponed, and that restraint itself can become a stable state rather than a temporary struggle. In a world where constant expression is normalized, silence also reduces cognitive load. Every act of communication requires mental energy, choosing words, managing impressions, anticipating reactions. When you reduce unnecessary speech, you conserve attention. That conserved attention can then be redirected toward tasks that require sustained effort, learning, or problem solving. This is why silence often coincides with increased clarity and focus. It is not mystical, it is economical. By removing low value outputs, the brain reallocates resources to higher order functions. Over time, this relocation strengthens the neural networks associated with deep work and self regulation. Silence becomes not just a behavior, but a structural change in how mental energy is distributed. Another overlooked aspect of silence is its role in breaking feedback dependence. Modern environments condition people to rely on constant external feedback to regulate their behavior and emotions. Like replies, acknowledgement, and reactions become signals that guide decisions. Silence removes those signals. When you stop broadcasting thoughts and plans, you stop receiving immediate validation or correction. This forces the brain to develop internal standards. Decisions must be evaluated based on personal goals and long-term outcomes rather than instant social response. This shift from external to internal regulation is a hallmark of mature self-control. It marks the transition from behavior driven by reaction to behavior guided by intention. Silence accelerates this transition by cutting off the external cues that keep people dependent on immediate reassurance. Silence also changes how the brain processes identity. When people talk frequently about who they are, what they believe, or what they plan to do, they often substitute words for action. The brain treats verbal declarations as partial completion, releasing dopamine as if progress has already been made. This reduces the motivation to follow through. Silence removes this shortcut. Without verbal reinforcement, the brain must rely on actual behavior to generate a sense of progress. This makes action more likely and more consistent. Over time, identity becomes grounded in what is done rather than what is said. This alignment between behavior and self concept strengthens self control because the brain no longer confuses expression with execution. Training silence does not mean withdrawing from communication entirely, it means being selective and intentional. Each moment of restraint is a repetition, and repetitions shape the brain. At first, silence feels effortful because it conflicts with conditioned habits of expression. But effort is the signal that training is occurring. As the brain adapts, silence becomes less about suppression and more about stability. The urge to react diminishes, not because it is constantly resisted, but because it is no longer automatically triggered. This is how self-control becomes less exhausting over time. It shifts from conscious struggle to unconscious competence. Silence, practiced consistently, rewires the brain's default responses, making regulation the norm rather than the exception. Ultimately, silence functions as a controlled environment where the core components of self-control are exercised simultaneously: impulse inhibition, delayed gratification, attention regulation, and internal evaluation. Few behaviors train all of these systems at once. That is why silence is such a powerful, underestimated tool. It does not require special circumstances or extraordinary willpower. It only requires the decision to pause when reaction is easy. Over time, that pause expands, creating space between stimulus and response. And in that space, the brain learns that control is not something it possesses by nature, but something it builds through repeated restraint and intentional withholding. The idea that self-control is a fixed trait is one of the most damaging myths in modern psychology. When people believe discipline is something you are born with, they unconsciously absolve themselves of responsibility for building it. This belief turns self-control into a moral label rather than a biological process. In reality, self-control is a skill rooted in neural circuitry, shaped by experience, repetition, and environment. It is not a personality feature, but a capacity that can be strengthened or weakened depending on how it is used. The brain is plastic, meaning it changes in response to repeated behavior. Every time you resist an impulse, delay gratification, or sustain focus, you are engaging specific neural networks that govern regulation and long term planning. Those networks grow stronger through use, just like muscles responding to resistance. Self control emerges from the interaction between multiple brain systems, particularly those involved in reward, attention, and executive function. The reward system pushes toward immediate pleasure, while regulatory systems evaluate consequences and future outcomes. When these systems are poorly trained, immediate rewards dominate behavior. This does not mean the person lacks character. it means the regulatory circuits have not been sufficiently exercised. Modern environments make this imbalance worse. Constant access to stimulation trains the reward system aggressively while leaving regulatory systems underused. Over time, this creates the illusion that some people are naturally disciplined while others are not, when the difference is actually the result of repeated exposure to different behavioral demands. Training self control requires friction. The brain does not strengthen regulation in the absence of challenge. Effortless environments may feel supportive, but they do little to build capacity. Friction introduces resistance, forcing the brain to engage regulatory circuits instead of defaulting to automatic reward seeking. This is why small, intentional challenges are effective. Choosing a slightly harder task, delaying a response, or staying focused despite discomfort all provide the kind of resistance that strengthens control. These acts do not need to be dramatic. In fact, consistent low-level resistance is more effective than rare bursts of extreme discipline. The brain responds best to regular, manageable challenges that reinforce regulation without overwhelming the system. Repetition is critical because neural change is incremental. A single act of self-control does not transform behavior, just as a single workout does not build strength. Each repetition lays down a small trace in the brain, reinforcing the pathways involved in restraint and planning. Over time, these traces accumulate, making controlled behavior easier and more automatic. What initially feels effortful gradually requires less conscious energy. This is the point at which people mistakenly label discipline as talent. They observe someone whose regulatory circuits are well developed and assume it must come naturally, unaware of the history of repetition that built that capacity. Delayed reward plays a central role in this process. Self-control is fundamentally about tolerating the gap between effort and payoff. Training it means learning to exist comfortably in that gap. When you delay gratification, the brain experiences mild discomfort because expected rewards are postponed. This discomfort is not a sign of failure, it is the signal that training is occurring. With repeated exposure, the brain recalibrates its expectations. The discomfort diminishes, and the delayed reward becomes more salient and motivating. This shift is crucial because it allows long-term goals to compete with immediate pleasures. Without this recalibration, the future remains abstract and unconvincing, and behavior remains driven by the present moment. Environment also shapes self-control by determining how often regulatory circuits are activated. People who appear disciplined often live in environments that support training rather than constant temptation. They reduce unnecessary choices, limit distractions, and structure their routines in ways that favor focus. This is not weakness, it is strategic. By designing environments that introduce appropriate friction and reduce impulsive triggers, they allow self-control to develop through consistent practice rather than constant struggle. Over time, the brain internalizes these patterns, making regulation more robust even when external supports are removed. The misconception that self-control requires extraordinary willpower leads many people to wait for motivation before acting. This reverses the actual process. Motivation is not the cause of discipline, it is the result of repeated controlled behavior. Each successful act of regulation reinforces a sense of agency and competence, which in turn increases motivation. This feedback loop explains why disciplined individuals often appear confident and self-directed. Their confidence is not the starting point, it is the byproduct of a brain that has learned it can follow through. Training self-control then is not about forcing yourself to be different, but about giving your brain the experiences it needs to build regulatory strength. Understanding self-control as a skill changes how setbacks are interpreted. Failure is no longer evidence of a flawed character, but information about where training is needed. Missed repetitions do not erase progress, they simply highlight areas for adjustment. This perspective reduces shame and increases persistence, both of which are essential for long-term change. When people see discipline as trainable, they are more likely to experiment, adapt, and continue practicing even when progress feels slow. Over time, this persistence compounds, reshaping behavior, identity, and outcomes in ways that appear effortless from the outside, but are rooted in consistent, deliberate training. Most people believe they struggle with focus because they are lazy, unmotivated, or mentally weak, but that interpretation misunderstands how attention actually works. Focus is not a personality trait, and it is not evenly distributed across people. It is a limited cognitive resource governed by specific neural systems that evolve to respond to novelty, threat, and reward. These systems are highly sensitive to stimulation, and in modern environments, they are constantly being pulled in multiple directions. When attention is repeatedly fragmented, the brain adapts by becoming efficient at switching rather than sustaining over time. This adaptation creates the experience of chronic distraction. The issue is not a lack of desire to focus, but a nervous system trained to expect frequent changes in input. Attention behaves like a muscle in the sense that it responds to how it is used. When it is constantly redirected toward new stimuli, The neural circuits responsible for sustained engagement weaken. When it is deliberately held on a single task, despite competing urges, those circuits strengthen. This process is slow and cumulative, which is why many people give up before they see results. Modern digital environments accelerate the weakening side of this equation. Notifications, feeds, and endless content provide rapid, unpredictable rewards that repeatedly hijack attention. Each interruption feels minor, but the cumulative effect is profound. The brain becomes conditioned to expect a novelty every few seconds, making stillness and sustained effort feel uncomfortable or even intolerable. Distraction is often misinterpreted as a moral failure rather than a training problem. People blame themselves for checking their phone, losing track of time, or struggling to concentrate without recognizing that their environment has been engineered to capture attention. This self-blame further undermines focus by creating stress and frustration, which degrade cognitive control. Training attention requires shifting the perspective from self-judgment to skill development. Just as physical strength is built through progressive overload, attentional strength is built by gradually increasing the duration and difficult focus. This means starting with manageable periods of concentration and extending them over time, allowing the brain to adapt without becoming overwhelmed. Social factors also play a significant role in attention leakage. The desire for validation, comparison, and belonging pulls attention outward. When people constantly monitor how they are perceived, their attention becomes fragmented between internal goals and external signals. This split reduces the depth of engagement possible in any single activity. Silence and self-focus reduce this leakage by removing the need to track external reactions. When attention is no longer divided by social monitoring, it can be directed more fully toward meaningful work. This is one reason why people often experience heightened focus when working alone or in environments with minimal social input. Another important aspect of attention is its relationship to reward timing. Sustained focus often involves delayed rewards, while distraction offers immediate gratification. The brain naturally gravitates toward what is immediately rewarding, especially when regulatory systems are undertrained. Training focus requires repeatedly choosing delayed rewards over immediate ones, even when the immediate option is more appealing. Each time this choice is made, the brain learns that sustained effort can lead to meaningful outcomes. Over time, the perceived value of delayed rewards increases, making focus less effortful. This shift does not happen through insight alone, but through repeated experience of effort followed by payoff. The concept of multitasking further obscures how attention works. While it feels efficient, multitasking actually degrades performance and increases cognitive fatigue. Switch between tasks carries a cost, forcing the brain to reorient and re-engage. Frequent switching trains the brain to remain in a shallow mode of processing where information is skimmed rather than deeply understood. This shallow processing reinforces the belief that focus is difficult or boring, when in reality the brain has not been given the opportunity to settle into deeper engagement. Reducing multitasking and allowing attention to remain on a single task long enough for immersion to occur is essential for rebuilding attentional strength. Training attention also involves learning to tolerate boredom. Boredom is not an enemy of focus, but a transitional state where the brain is adjusting to reduce stimulation. When people immediately escape boredom through distraction, they prevent this adjustment from taking place. Allowing boredom to exist without reacting teaches the brain that it does not need constant input to function. This tolerance is closely linked to self-control because both involve resisting the urge for immediate relief. As tolerance increases, focus becomes more stable and the mind becomes less reactive to minor urges. Environment design is a practical lever for attention training. Removing unnecessary stimuli, setting clear boundaries around work and rest, and creating cues that signal when focus is required all support the development of sustained attention. These strategies reduce the number of decisions the brain must make, conserving cognitive resources for the task at hand. Over time, these environmental supports become internalized, allowing focus to persist even in less controlled settings. The result is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual increase in the capacity to direct attention intentionally rather than having it constantly pulled by external forces. When attention is treated as a trainable resource rather than a fixed trait, the path to focus becomes clearer, more compassionate, and ultimately more effective. Modern life has changed faster than the human brain can adapt, and this mismatch sits at the core of why self-control feels increasingly difficult. The brain evolved in environments defined by scarcity, unpredictability, and physical effort. Attention was directed toward survival-relevant cues, and rewards were delayed, uncertain, and earned through sustained action. In that context, self-control was not an abstract virtue, it was a practical necessity. Regulating impulses meant conserving energy, waiting for the right moment, and coordinating behavior with long-term outcomes. The neural systems that govern these functions developed under conditions that required restraint as a default state. Today, those same systems are placed in environments of constant abundance, immediate reward, and relentless stimulation. This shift fundamentally alters how regulatory mechanisms function. The modern environment continuously activates the brain's reward system without requiring effort or delay. Notifications, social validation, entertainment, and information are delivered instantly, often with minimal cost. Each of these inputs triggers small dopamine releases, training the brain to expect frequent rewards. Over time, this expectation becomes the baseline. When rewards are delayed or effort is required, the brain experiences discomfort and interprets it as a problem to be solved rather than normal part of goal-directed behavior. This is why tasks that require sustained focus or patience can feel disproportionately difficult, even when they are objectively manageable. The brain has not lost its capacity for self-control. It has been retrained to operate under different assumptions about effort and reward. This retraining is subtle and cumulative. No single notification or convenience erodes self-control on its own. The effect emerges from repetition. Each instance of immediate gratification reinforces a learning pattern. Relief and pleasure are available instantly, and waiting is unnecessary. Over time, this pattern reshapes motivational priorities. Long-term goals begin to feel distant and abstract, while short-term rewards dominate decision-making. The regulatory systems responsible for evaluating future outcomes become underutilized, not because they are damaged, but because the environment rarely demands their activation. Like any underused system, they weaken through disuse. The pace of modern life compounds this problem. Rapid information flow and constant context switching prevent the brain from settling into states of deep engagement. This constant switching keeps the nervous system in a heightened state of alertness, which consumes cognitive resources and reduces the capacity for self-regulation. When the brain is perpetually managing incoming stimuli, it has less bandwidth available for planning, reflection, and inhibition. This leads to a sense of mental fatigue that is often mistaken for laziness or lack of discipline. In reality, it is a predictable response to an environment that overloads attentional systems. Social dynamics further intensify the challenge. Modern platforms amplify comparison, evaluation, and visibility, making social feedback a constant presence. The brain is highly sensitive to social signals because, historically, social standing affected survival and reproduction. In ancestral environments, social feedback was intermittent and meaningful. Today, it is continuous and often trivial. This constant feedback loop keeps the brain oriented toward external validation, drawing attention away from internal goals. The desire to be seen, acknowledged, or approved of competes directly with the effort required to maintain self-control. When external signals are prioritized, internal regulation weakens. The concept of effort itself has been redefined by modern convenience. Many activities that once required physical or cognitive exertion have been automated or simplified. While this increases efficiency, it also reduces opportunities for incidental training of self-control. Tasks that once demanded patience, problem solving, and persistence are now completed with minimal engagement. This reduction in everyday effort means the brain has fewer chances to practice regulation in low-stakes contexts. As a result, when high-stakes challenges arise, regulatory capacity feels insufficient. The issue is not that the brain cannot handle effort, but that it has not been regularly exercised in environments that demand it. Another important factor is the normalization of constant stimulation as a default state. Silence, waiting, and inactivity are often framed as unproductive or uncomfortable. This framing encourages immediate engagement with stimuli whenever there is a pause. The brain learns to associate stillness with discomfort and stimulation with relief. Over time, this association undermines the ability to remain present without external input. Self-control requires the capacity to tolerate moments of low stimulation without seeking escape. When this capacity is eroded, even brief pauses can trigger restlessness and impulsive behavior. Despite these challenges, the brain remains adaptable. The same plasticity that allows modern environments to erode self-control can be harnessed to rebuild it. The key lies in recognizing that the environment is not neutral. It actively shapes behavior through repeated exposure and reinforcement. By intentionally altering inputs and reducing unnecessary stimulation, it is possible to restore balance between reward seeking and regulatory systems. This does not require rejecting modern life, but engaging with it more deliberately. Introducing periods of reduced stimulation, effortful activity, and delayed reward signals the brain that regulation is still necessary and valuable. Understanding the mismatch between evolved brain systems and modern environments reframes the struggle with self-control. It shifts the narrative from personal failure to contextual challenge. This perspective does not excuse impulsive behavior, but it explains it, providing a clearer path toward change. When people stop interpreting difficulty as evidence of inadequacy and start seeing it as a predictable outcome of environmental conditioning, they are more likely to take constructive action. Self-control becomes a matter of alignment rather than force. of shaping conditions that support regulation instead of constantly fighting against those that undermine it. In this way, reclaiming self control is less about resisting modern life and more about intentionally reintroducing the challenges and constraints that the brain evolved to navigate. Identity is often treated as the starting point of change, as if people must first see themselves as disciplined, focused, or self controlled before they can act that way. This belief feels intuitive, but it reverses how the brain actually works. The brain does not wait for identity to shift before adjusting behavior. It updates identity after observing repeated actions. What you do consistently becomes the evidence your brain uses to decide who you are. This is why motivation based on self image is unreliable. If your current behavior does not support the identity you want, the brain rejects it as fantasy. Real identity change begins at the level of action, specifically small, repeatable behaviors that demonstrate control. Every time you act with restraint, even in minor ways, you provide your brain with data. That data is processed unconsciously and used to update self concept. One instance of control does not carry much weight, but repetition creates a pattern. The brain is a pattern recognition system above all else. When it detects consistency, it begins to treat that behavior as representative. This is why disciplined people often describe their habits as automatic rather than effortful. Their identity did not emerge first and then guide their actions. Their actions accumulated until the brain concluded that discipline was part of who they are. This process explains why waiting to feel like a disciplined person rarely works. Feelings follow interpretation, and interpretation follows evidence. If the evidence says you avoid effort, seek distraction, and give in to impulses, the brain constructs an identity around those observations. No amount of positive thinking can override that data. Conversely, when you begin acting with control even while feeling unmotivated, you disrupt the old narrative. The brain is forced to reconcile new evidence that contradicts previous assumptions. At first, this creates cognitive friction. Acting disciplined while not identifying as discipline feels uncomfortable. But that discomfort is temporary. With repetition, the new behavior becomes familiar and the identity shifts to reduce internal conflict. Self control plays a unique role in this process because it is visible to the brain in moments of tension. Acts of restraint stand out more than acts of ease. Choosing not to react, not to indulge, or not to quit requires conscious regulation, which makes these moments more salient in memory. The brain assigns greater significance to behaviors performed under resistance. This means that even small acts of self control can have an outsized impact on identity formation if they occur consistently. Over time, the brain begins to associate effort and restraint with the self, while impulsive behavior becomes less representative. Silence and focus accelerate this identity shift by removing performative behaviors that create false signals. When people talk about their goals, values, or discipline, the brain often treats those declarations as partial fulfillment. Dopamine is released, reducing the drive to act. Silence removes that shortcut without verbal reinforcement. The only available evidence comes from behavior. This forces identity to be built on execution rather than intention. The result is a more stable and accurate self concept, grounded in what is done rather than what is said. Another important aspect of identity formation is predictability. The brain values consistency because it allows for efficient decision making. When behavior is erratic, identity remains unstable. When behavior becomes predictable, identity solidifies. This is why routines are so powerful. Repeated actions performed in similar contexts reduce cognitive load and increase the brain's confidence in its predictions. Each successful repetition strengthens the association between the self and controlled behavior. Over time, this association becomes the default lens through which future choices are interpreted. Acting with discipline stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like alignment. This shift also changes how setbacks are interpreted. When identity is behavior based, failure is no longer evidence of inadequacy, but a deviation from a known pattern. The brain expects a return to the norm rather than a collapse. This expectation reduces the emotional impact of mistakes and increases resilience. People with stable identities built on repeated control recover faster because their sense of self is not threatened by temporary lapses. The behavior came first, but the identity now protects the behavior. Importantly, identity formed through action is context sensitive. The brain does not generalize discipline from one domain to all others automatically. Control must be demonstrated repeatedly in relevant contexts for identity to update in those areas. This is why self-control feels uneven for many people. They may be disciplined in work, but impulsive with health or relationships. Identity updates locally before it updates globally. Over time, as controlled behavior appears across multiple domains, the brain begins to infer a broader trait. This is when people are described as disciplined or focused in general. Even though the process began with narrow, specific actions, the order of operations matters. Action creates evidence, evidence reshapes identity, and identity reinforces future action. Reversing this order leads to frustration and stagnation. People who wait for confidence before acting remain stuck because confidence is an outcome, not a prerequisite. Those who act despite uncertainty give the brain the raw material it needs to build a stronger self concept. This is why self control training often feels unglamorous and repetitive. The work happens before the identity reward appears. Over time, as controlled behaviors accumulate, the internal dialogue changes. Decisions require less deliberation because the brain defaults to choices consistent with the established identity. Temptations lose some of their power because acting on them would violate a well supported self concept. This does not eliminate effort entirely, but it reduces friction. The brain prefers coherence. Once a disciplined identity is established, maintaining it requires less energy than constantly switching between conflicting behaviors. Understanding that identity follows behavior removes the pressure to become someone new overnight. It reframes change as a process of accumulation rather than transformation. Each act of self control is a vote cast for a future self, and votes add up whether or not they feel significant in the moment. The brain is always watching what you do, not what you promise. Over time, it draws conclusions, updates expectations, and reshapes the sense of who you are based on the patterns you repeat most often. At the heart of lasting change lies a simple truth: discipline is not about who you are, it's about what you do. Your brain is constantly watching, tracking, and learning from your actions. Every moment you choose silence over distraction, patience over impulse, focus over noise, or effort over ease, you are training the most powerful muscles you have: self control, attention, and identity. Modern life is designed to steal these resources, but by understanding how your brain actually works, you reclaim them. Small, repeated choices build skills, shape your identity, and make discipline automatic. The future version of yourself isn't waiting to appear magically, it is being written every time you act with control in the present. So stop hoping to feel disciplined and start acting disciplined. Your focus will grow, and your life will quietly transform one deliberate choice at a time.